Hello everyone, welcome back to the Zach GP channel, and in today's video I have the final post FP2 video for F1 Fantasy of the year. Of course, heading into Abu Dhabi, it's the final Grand Prix of the season, so that means the final F1 Fantasy, technically F1 Fantasy related video before the season ends goes live. So before we actually go into it, I just want to thank you all again for the support over the last year that the channel's had. And hey, onwards and upwards for next year. It's going to be an exciting one in 2026. I can't tell you how excited I am for F1 Fantasy in 2026. With the new regs, it's going to make the pricing system an absolute nightmare, which I'm hoping adds some spice to the season. However, as per usual, in these videos, I go through the most up-to-date stats and data that we have to now build our teams before the deadline, before qualifying starts. Now, as you've seen to my left, you can see that budget building does not matter anymore. So that slideshow I used to show at the start of videos every single time for plus 0.6 or minus 0.6, etc. doesn't matter anymore, because hey, if you gain 2 million this weekend or if you lose 2 million, we're all heading back to 100 million for 2026. So let's head over to Zach GP's rankings of every asset in F1 Fantasy heading into Abu Dhabi. So heading straight into the A-tier drivers after FP2, and for me it's actually quite straightforward where everyone is. I think there's only a few positions that I had to think about, but we have to talk about the main man himself, Lando Norris, in the first position, and quite rightly for me. In FP2 he was almost 4 tenths quicker than Verstappen in second place. Now I know it is just FP2, but these are quali sims, so they are very important for helping us know which car looks the fastest, which driver looks on it. And right now, it's screaming Lando Norris right at me. What makes this quite interesting as well is because we have such a level price between Norris and Verstappen, it really is, if you can't afford both of them, Norris or Verstappen. And right now, I have to say, it looks like Team Norris. It looks like he's going to win the championship if he continues this form, which would be driver of the day. Looks like he's the favourite now for fastest lap. If it continues like this, everything's looking in Lando Norris's favour. However, don't forget about Max Verstappen. 100%, if you can afford to bring in Norris and Verstappen, I highly recommend doing that with 2 A-tier constructors. However, it does look like Max Verstappen is second fiddle right now. I still like him as a differential if you want to go for that max push for the final, if you want to just go for the one, because I do think Norris will be the one that most people go towards now. If you want to go for that differential, Verstappen's still there. And then Piastri's third place, just because his push lap wasn't incredible. There's definitely a lot more pace in that McLaren than he's shown, because he wasn't even in the top 10 in FP2. So I'm not worried about Piastri. He'll be back in the top 5 minimum. So again, it would probably be, if you can't afford Verstappen, go to Norris, Piastri. And then the big differential, again, if you think something crazy is going to happen in a race, then you could go to George Russell. However, that's where I draw the line. You've really got to be running out of money if you can only afford Norris, Russell. That's the only situation I could see going over to George Russell. However, those are the A-tier drivers, not even worth mentioning Ferrari drivers at the minute. And heading into the A-tier constructors, again, it's quite an easy one this week, heading out from FP2 and FP1. Very much is McLaren. We say this week in, week out. If they don't screw up, they are consistently the fastest. And it looks like, again, heading into Abu Dhabi, they have the upper hand. So I do think McLaren is the consistent key constructor that everyone has to have in their team. And from what we've seen, I don't think there's enough of a differential push to not have them anymore. Then I would say Mercedes is the next best, purely because, again, Antonelli we know can get into the top 10 with Russell. I don't think any other A-tier constructor team can say that right now. Not Williams, not Ferrari, not Red Bull could have 2 of their drivers in the top 10 100%. So I still like Mercedes as that option, and they're also the cheapest out of Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull. However, if you do want a differential and you think Verstappen's got a chance to win the race, that's when you'd head over to Red Bull and you'd go with McLaren and Red Bull. But again, they cost more, gives you less flexibility in your team, so it very much would be, again, a big differential play. Then heading into the B-tier drivers, and I think this is the most fun we can have this weekend for figuring out what sort of teams we want to make. Purely because I do want to state this again, obviously the budgeting doesn't matter. So people like Bortoletto, Hulkenberg, Stroll, all of these people are in play. But I do want to state B-tier drivers, as important as they are, just remember what the rest of your team looks like. Let's say you've only got 2 free transfers, or you've got the max of 3 free transfers, and you've got to try to fit in either Norris, Verstappen, you've got to change any of your A-tier drivers around, you've got to change a constructor, and you only have 1 transfer for the B-tier drivers. It doesn't matter too much who it ends up being, in a sense of you'll be in my situation where I've got to sort out my A-tier drivers first, then I'll have a look with 1 transfer. So it might end up with me having Colapinto in my team. It might end up with you having someone like an Alonso, etc. Even though they might not be as high on my rankings, it doesn't matter as much. However, if you have a wildcard or a lot of leeway to move around your B-tier drivers, for me, Behrman looks the most comfortable. He is a very expensive asset right now in F1 Fantasy. However, he was loving it. He was actually over the team radio talking about how much he loved his Haas at the moment. So no surprises, he's at the top of my list, because out of everyone, I'm the most confident in him being able to have a brilliant weekend now. However, if you don't have that money, second best would definitely be Isaac Hadjar. I definitely think it's going to be between Behrman and Hadjar for who everyone has in their team, depending on different budget reigns. Hadjar, he looked half decent, and considering you know the Racing Bulls will always be thereabouts, I'm happy to have him as a very firm option for everyone to bring in, considering he is just behind both the Saubers in FP2, and realistically I have a lot more faith in Hadjar being able to keep pace than I do with the Saubers, which is actually why in third place for the best B-tier driver, we've got Carlos Sainz. Again, form of recent races, he's been incredible. Williams, I expect to pick up the pace a little bit. Williams should be a little bit quicker than this. I don't think it's going to be one of those tracks where they completely drop off, but they haven't shown much yet. That's why he's not first place. But again, I still have a little bit of faith in Carlos Sainz to be up there. So I think 100% those 3, if you can fit in any of Behrman, Hadjar and Sainz to your team, you're living life. And honestly, from that point onwards, it's a bit of a free-for-all, because the Saubers, you never know if they're going to keep pace or not. And even if they did, would they get overtaken in the race? You then also have the people who did badly in FP2, like Gasly and Colapinto and Lawson, who look quite tasty, because if they're at the back of the grid, chance to just reap the rewards of any chaos that happens. Any overtakes, they can't lose positions, being dead last. So you get more into that. But I can't state enough. Realistically, it comes down to who do you have in your team. If you've only got 1 or 2 free transfers to go, I'd probably recommend bringing in Behrman, Hadjar or Sainz into that team. And if you needed a cheaper option, then you'd be looking at someone like Hulkenberg or Alonso as well. Then finally, for the Jack GP tier list, let's head into B-tier constructors. And again, it's one of those weekends I don't recommend going for one of them. If you're struggling for a bit of budget and you do need to go to a Norris, Verstappen, McLaren build, I could understand looking towards someone like a Sauber or a Haas or a Racing Bulls. However, for most normal teams, I wouldn't recommend going with a B-tier constructor. But if you do, it does look like Haas, with Behrman looking so strong, looks very good there. Racing Bulls, again, they've looked half decent so far with Hadjar, and also we know they are half decent most of the time throughout the year so far. So I'm comfortable with Haas and Racing Bulls the most on the B-tier constructors. However, with that said and done, let's now head over to your chips that you can use in Abu Dhabi. Now let's quickly talk about the chips that you can use in Abu Dhabi. The reason it's not going to be a hard thing to talk about is because it really is as simple as, if you've got 1 chip left, you just use it. That is plain and simple as it goes. However, if you're in a predicament where sadly maybe you have 2 or more chips still in Abu Dhabi, maybe you started late or maybe you just forgot about one of the chips, then here is my list down below. As you can see, I still think extra DRS without a doubt would be the best chip, no matter how many chips you have left would be to use. Then it would be Limitless, again, most amount of points possible. Then it would be something like No Negative, purely because I do predict a couple of crashes. Then Autopilot, because again, we really don't know who's going to be winning this race, who's going to be getting fastest lap driver of the day. It all depends on the championship winner. Where does Norris finish? Where does Piastri finish? Where does Verstappen finish? Whoever you have in your team. Then I would say Final Fix. Then I'd say Wildcard. Wildcard really just because I don't think there's too many changes that a lot of people need to have with their teams. And also, if I had extra DRS, I'd take the -10 instead of using the wild card, etc. But that is how I would play with the chips this weekend. So now let's head over to your team selections. So heading into the team selections for Abu Dhabi, we'll start off with the big budget teams. And this is like my ideal team out of the entire weekend for anyone out there who can afford it. By the way, this is ridiculously pricey, so only a few will be able to afford it. However, it's a good starting point for how the rest of the teams will follow, so don't worry, I will be going down the cost cap to eventually where you will be able to own a team if you cannot afford to run something like this. But realistically, the foundations of all of the teams are going to be Norris 2 times. For the more generic meta teams out there, with Verstappen, McLaren and Mercedes, I think that is a dead set for anyone who can afford to bring these sorts of drivers in. Then B tier driver wise, we'll go through my ladder as well. But you really want to have Behrman, Hadjar, Sainz. Again, those are the big three that I would start off with. But again, follow me down this little ladder and you can do this for every single team out there when it comes to having 3 B tier drivers if you can't afford this. So first of all, I would go Carlos Sainz down to Pierre Gasly. Gasly down to Lawson. Lawson down to Hulkenberg. Hulkenberg down to Alonso, and then finally Alonso to Colapinto. So actually there are a lot of options for the B tier drivers, but again it comes down to who do you have in your team, who can you afford, and again if you can't afford this team, that's actually where again I would go down the list with Hadjar. So you'd go from Hadjar down to Gasly, Gasly down to Lawson, Lawson down to Hulkenberg, and then eventually Hulkenberg down to an Alonso. And again, finally, if you still can't afford this team, that's where you head over to Behrman and you go through every single driver I've just mentioned. However, you add Carlos Sainz in first, Isaac Hadjar in next, Pierre Gasly then, Liam Lawson, and then finishing it off with Nico Hulkenberg. And this is for everyone who really wants to fit in the Norris, Verstappen, McLaren, Mercedes teams. And finally, if you really want to have both Norris and Verstappen because you think that is the way to go and you're not comfortable with Russell or Piastri, that is where eventually I would look into a B tier constructor if you want to follow this 2 A tier premium, big premium driver builds and go to Racing Bulls. Then if you can't afford Racing Bulls, over to Haas. And then the huge differential, if you can't afford any of these, that's where you'd have to drop down to a Sauber and use them at 8.7 million. But again, a lot of people can run this team if they do drop down the B tier constructor. Again, I'd say once you're getting into this territory, however, you're starting to look on a little bit of a differential side of things, especially considering I don't think the difference between Verstappen and Piastri will be more than 10 points. It depends on who you're 2-timesing. But then again, if you have full trust in the triple McLaren builds that we've actually started to see pop up quite a bit more recently, and you have Norris 2 times with Piastri instead of Verstappen because Piastri cost a lot less than Verstappen, about 5-ish million less, then again you start off with a team with Sainz, Behrman, Hadjar. You do that whole ladder down like I showed before, where you can drop Sainz all the way down to Colapinto, then Hadjar down to an Alonso, Behrman down to Hulkenberg. It's just as simple as that. And if you still can't afford a team like this and you really want to run McLaren, Mercedes, Norris and another premium driver, then that's eventually where you would go over to George Russell instead of Piastri. But again, this is as far as I would push it for 2 A tier driver builds. Then you'd have to go into looking to get rid of that B tier constructor, or if you just don't have enough money, you just stick with the one Lando Norris build. So if you can only afford to have one single premium driver, I would still stick with Lando Norris. Again, from what we've seen in FP1 and FP2, he looks like the driver to beat right now, so I'll put my 2 times on him, with Gasly just adding to the ranks. And again, we just follow that little ladder down that I told you all about before. So we start off with Gasly, bring him down to Lawson, Lawson down to Hulkenberg, Hulkenberg down to an Alonso, Alonso down to Colapinto. Then we do the same thing for Carlos Sainz, down to Gasly, Lawson, Hulkenberg, Alonso, Hadjar, down to Gasly, Lawson, Hulkenberg, and then finally Behrman as well, going from Sainz to Hadjar, to Gasly, to Lawson. And that is the lowest probably teams I would go for. If you're still needing a little bit more money, then again, that's where I'd have to drop Mercedes down to Racing Bulls. But it's just as simple as that, everyone, this weekend. Although it's an exciting race weekend for the finale, F1 Fantasy wise, it looks like it's pretty clear cut on what we actually have to use and don't use, unless you want to go for a differential. So that is it, everyone. Thank you all so much for watching my final post FP2 F1 Fantasy video. Of course, thank you all so much for watching. I really do hope that this video was helpful for everyone out there. As per usual, please like and subscribe. It really does help the channel. And as per usual, with all of these videos, please comment down below any questions that you have, whether it be F1 Fantasy related or if it's just F1 related, any of these questions that you need help with down below in the comments, and I can try and help out all of your teams, because again, it's a lot of individual questions that need to be asked because every team is different. However, if you still need a little bit more help after FP2, after FP3, and just before qualifying, an hour before, I will be live on the FanAmp channel with our final deadline show. So come over there and enjoy the final show. And hey, that is all from me today. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you have a nice rest of your day, and I'll see you all very soon. Take care, everyone.